Have you ever seen a human being lying in the snow, abandoned, as if their life no longer carried any worth in this world, out on the American frontier? Such cruelty was nothing unusual, and people learned to turn their heads away. But on that day, Elias Mercer, a man burdened by the shadow of his past sins, faced that very moment, a moment that could change everything. Before we dive deeper into this story, don't forget to hit that like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is the fire that keeps stories of the Old West alive. And I promise, if you stay with me until the end, you won't just see the harshness of fate, you'll see how one decision, made in silence, opened the door to an entirely new life. It was the winter of 1882 in the northern woods of Texas. The land was locked in ice that cut like knives. The wind screamed through the tall pines, carrying a chill straight into a man's bones. The sky sagged heavy and gray, like a burial cloth stretched over the world. Elias Mercer trudged slowly along the trail, his coat pulled tight, his gloved hands pressed into his sides for warmth. He was just past 30, though the years of loss carved deeper lines into his face. 5 winters earlier, fever had taken his bride-to-be, and ever since, Elias had buried himself at the timberline in a cabin of his own making. His days followed a rhythm so plain it felt like ritual. Check the rabbit traps, gather wood, return home before dark. He avoided people. He wanted no questions, no kindness, no chance to reopen wounds that never healed. For Elias lived with guilt, a guilt that gnawed at him in every silence. He had failed Elizabeth, failed to bring her to the doctor in time. He could still see her eyes in those last hours, the heat of the fever burning her skin, while he sat helpless, fumbling. Since then, he had sworn a vow. No more. Don't bring anyone back. Don't carry anyone else's burden. But fate never honors such vows for long. That morning, as he moved along a frost-crusted bend in the trail, Elias froze. Just off the path, beside a thicket of brush, lay a dark bundle. At first he thought it was rags, or worse, the carcass of some beast. He took a step closer, his stomach knotted. It was a woman, an old Apache woman. She lay curled tight, one arm locked around a threadbare satchel, the other limp in the snow. Her fingers were swollen and purple from exposure. Her hair, streaked with gray, had come undone in the wind. Her skin was cracked, her lips split and bloody. And yet, when Elias knelt beside her, the woman's eyes were open, sunken, hollow, but shining with a strange, quiet pride. He reached out, his knee popping in the cold. Her body was feather-light, almost brittle, but still faintly warm. Her breath came shallow, ragged, barely holding on. Inside Elias, 2 voices clashed. One was familiar, sharp, relentless. Walk away. You've carried enough pain. Strangers only bring trouble. Leave her. That was the voice that had ruled him since Elizabeth's death. But another voice pressed back, quieter but stronger. If you leave her, you are no different from those who turned away when Elizabeth fell ill. You say you won't save anyone again, but isn't that just an excuse to run? How long can you hide from the weight of being human? The Apache woman didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply looked at him, steady, as if daring him to decide. And in that gaze, Elias saw Elizabeth once more, saw the same calm acceptance she'd shown in her final moments. Not blame, not anger, just a silent trust that he would choose rightly. His breath clouded in the air. He stood, turned, took 3 steps down the trail. The wind tore at his coat, howling like judgment itself. He stopped. He closed his eyes and remembered the basin of water cooling in his useless hands while Elizabeth burned. He remembered the helplessness that had never released him. And he knew if he left this woman to die, That guilt would bury him deeper than any grave. So Elias turned back. He stripped the saddle blanket from his mule, Slate, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he lifted her gently. She weighed little more than a bundle of sticks. The woman didn't resist. She leaned into him, her eyes still clear, still proud. Elias steadied her with one arm and guided Slate with the other. Each step back toward his cabin pressed heavier on his chest. Not pity, not charity responsibility. A responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one he could no longer turn away from. Elias Mercer had thought bringing an old Apache woman back to his cabin was already more than he should have allowed himself. He had sworn off such things years ago. Yet only minutes later, fate hurled another trial straight into his path, a trial that struck him like a hammer against iron. They hadn't gone far when the frail woman, still shivering under his rough blanket, suddenly stopped. She turned, her hollow eyes flashing with an iron glint. Her voice rasped, every word dragging breath from her chest. "You need a wife. My daughter is perfect for you." Elias froze, his whole body locking tight. Surely he had misheard. A wife. That word had been buried with Elizabeth in 1877. It was a sealed door, one no one was meant to open again. And here, on a frost-bitten trail, a stranger dared to strike it with her bare hand. Before he could react, the woman lifted 2 fingers to her lips and whistled a sharp, echoing sound that cut through the timber like a war cry. From the tree line behind them, maybe 20 paces out, a figure moved. Elias tightened Slate's reins. His free hand slipped to the knife on his belt. On this frontier, any sudden sign could mean ambush, could mean blood. Then the figure stepped out of the trees. Not a warrior, not a raider, a girl. She walked slowly, each step as if carved from exhaustion. Yet she remained upright, deliberate. She wore only a torn deerskin dress, fringe clinging to her thighs. Her bare feet were red and swollen from the cold. Her dark hair, thick and heavy, hung in twin braids, decorated with bits of feather and leather cord. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, but her eyes calm. Unflinching, showed no fear, no pleading. Elias swallowed hard. He was not a man easily softened by beauty, but he couldn't deny she startled him. Against the pale snow and bare timber, she looked too vivid. There was strength in her bearing, though her body trembled. The look of someone long used to being watched, yet refusing to bow. The mother spoke again, her tone flat and final. Leaving no room for debate, we were cast out. Too much jealousy, too much shame. "My daughter is strong. She can cook, she can work. She needs safety." The words struck Elias like blow's wife. Perfect for you. They scraped against the locked doors of his memory, prying where he had buried his heart. For a moment, suspicion rose sharp in him. A trick, a trade, some desperate bargain. He looked at the girl. Nayeli, though he didn't know her name yet. She met his gaze for a flicker of a moment, then lowered her eyes. Not begging, not challenging, just tired, waiting. His heart thudded hard. He knew he could turn his back right there. He had reasons enough. A man of solitude didn't need more burdens. His past had taught him closeness only meant loss. But his boots stayed planted, as before with the mother. He felt that if he walked away now, her face would haunt his sleep as Elizabeth's had for years. He hesitated, caught between suspicion and pity, between fear and responsibility. The reins cut into his fingers, white-knuckled. His eyes shifted from the mother's burning certainty to the daughter's quiet resignation. Around them the wind howled, but all Elias heard was the pounding of his own blood. Finally. He said nothing at all. No promise, no refusal. He only turned, tugged gently at Slate's lead, and started walking toward his cabin. A moment later, soft footsteps followed. The girl trailed behind him, then the old woman, slow but steady. Elias did not turn, but inside his chest something shifted heavy, immovable, as if fate had laid 2 new souls upon his shoulders, and he knew he would not be rid of them again. The walk stretched nearly an hour. No one spoke. The mother leaned against Slate, gripping the blanket with all her strength. The girl followed in silence, her pace faltering, yet steady, and for the first time in years. Elias realized on this frozen trail, he was not walking alone. The old pine door groaned as Elias Mercer pushed it open. The cabin was small, just enough space for a rough-hewn table, a single bed against the wall, a wood stove glowing faintly, and a few tools hanging loose on the timbers. For Elias, it had been his whole world these past 5 years, a world tight, silent, and suffocating at times. Now, in that familiar space, there were 2 new breaths of life. He slipped off his coat and hung it on the iron hook. "There's some rabbit stew left from the morning," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He ladled out what remained, filled 2 bowls, and handed them to the old woman Tala and the younger woman. "Nayeli." "No thanks. No questions, only silence." Tala ate slowly, with the dignity of someone who had learned to starve without shame. Nayeli kept her head lowered, eating faster, but careful not to appear desperate. Elias sat near the window, his own bowl in hand. His eyes lingered on the fire, watching flames lick the dry wood. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of spoons and the wind battering the walls. The silence felt heavy, unfamiliar. Elias wasn't used to sharing his cabin, didn't know where to set his eyes, didn't know how to carry himself with company. After the meal, he dug into a chest and pulled out a few worn blankets, spreading them near the stove. "You'll sleep here." "It's warmer," he muttered, avoiding their gaze. Tala nodded faintly. Nayeli said nothing, only wrapped her ragged dress tighter around herself. Night fell. Wind hissed over the roof. Snow rattled against the shutters. Elias sat in his usual chair, staring into the flames. On the floor, Nayeli lay curled beside her mother, her back turned to him, long hair spilling over her shoulder. Something about that fragile form tugged at him, a sharp reminder of Elizabeth's last night's slender frame. Quiet endurance. His chest tightened. He forced his eyes away, whispering inwardly, "Don't let the past fool you again." By morning, faint light leaked through the slats. Elias stirred awake to find Nayeli already up, kneeling by the stove. She fed the fire with careful hands, coaxing it to life. Her dark hair hung loose over her cheek, her fingers red from the cold but steady in their work. Elias stood there a long moment, silent, afraid that words might shatter the simple calm of that scene. The days slipped into a new rhythm. Nayeli didn't speak much, but her hands were never idle. She stitched at Tala's torn shawl, swept the ash from around the hearth, fetched water from the creek without being asked, even worn thin from hunger and cold. She refused to be still. Silence, Elias realized, was her shield, the only way to keep dignity intact, for a man long accustomed to solitude. Elias found himself unsettled. While he split wood outside, he would catch the faint shape of her at the doorway. When he carried in water, he'd find a rag already laid out for him to wipe his hands. Small things, but enough to unsteady him. He had thought this cabin would forever echo with silence and memories alone. Yet now, a young Apache woman filled that emptiness simply by being there. One afternoon, he was checking a trap when he saw her coming from the creek, carrying a heavy pail. She staggered, nearly falling. Elias hurried forward, catching her arm. Her skin was ice cold beneath his hand, and the contact jolted him. He pulled away too quickly, face burning. I can manage," Nayeli whispered softly, firm despite her weariness. Elias gave a stiff nod and stepped back. But that evening, the memory of her chilled skin lingered, leaving him restless. The boundary between them was clear. He was the master of the cabin, she the guest. Yet Elias treated her differently. He gave no orders, pressed no demands. And somehow, that unspoken respect became its own bridge across the space between them. One stormy night, Tala coughed harshly, and Nayeli sat awake by her side. Elias fed the fire, stealing a glance at the girl's tired eyes glinting in the glow. There was no complaint in her face, only resolve. He looked away quickly, uneasy with the pull he felt toward that quiet strength. The next morning, Elias led Slate to the corral and returned to find Nayeli's dress, freshly washed, hanging near the stove. She had cinched it at the waist with a strip of leather. Practical for work. Such a small thing. Yet Elias paused, struck by her resilience making do with scraps, carrying herself with a dignity sharpened by hardship. Inside him, confusion grew. He didn't know how close to stand, didn't know how long to let the silence stretch. But each night, as he sat in his chair and watched Nayeli tuck her mother in, then curl herself in a tight ball by the fire, Elias knew one thing: he was no longer the only soul in this cabin, and that presence, awkward and unsettling as it was, made the place warmer than it had been in years. Winter dragged on. The northern wind carried damp air that slapped against the old cabin walls, making them creak and moan through the night. Inside that narrow space, 3 people now lived beneath one roof, yet each carried silences of their own. Elias Mercer, as always, worked outside splitting wood, mending the fence, checking his snares. Inside, Nayeli tended to her mother, swept the floor, and kept the fire alive. One evening, when Tala had fallen into exhausted sleep, Nayeli sat by the stove, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the flames. Elias stepped in from the yard, setting aside his axe, and caught the stillness of her posture. She rarely spoke, letting her work speak for her. But that night, the fire seemed to draw something out. "Have you ever heard of someone being called a curse?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but hoarse. Elias paused at the doorway, then crossed to his chair. He peeled off his gloves, breathing into his stiff fingers. "I've heard it," he said slowly. Never believed it. A small smile curved on her lips, a smile without joy. "They called me that. They said when men looked at me, it brought shame. They said those looks tore the people apart. So they decided I wasn't allowed to stay." When the words left her, silence pressed down on the room. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and Elias saw how tightly her fingers dug into her palms, knuckles pale. It wasn't the cold that made her shake, it was the weight of years carrying someone else's judgment. He drew a breath, staring at the fire. Memories of Elizabeth rose unbidden, her body wasting under fever. The whispers that blamed him for not saving her. He knew too well what it was to bear guilt that wasn't yours to choose. "You're not the mistake," Elias said, his voice low. Nayeli startled, as if unsure she'd heard him right. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," he answered, eyes on the flame so she wouldn't feel trapped by his gaze. "There are deaths people pinned on me." Said a man failed his bride. I've carried that 5 years now. But truth is, some things are beyond us. People blame because it's easier than understanding. She nodded slowly. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Perhaps her tears had long since run dry. Still. In her look he caught something fragile, a flicker of relief, as if for the first time. Someone didn't see her as a curse. From that night, Elias began to change things quietly. He cleared out the old shed, swept away rusted tools, laid down planks, and set blankets inside. By day, he gave mother and daughter space to rest there. By night, he still kept them near the stove for warmth. The cabin was small, but he arranged it so each had a place, not just a corner of the floor. Nayeli noticed, though she never asked. Instead, she answered in kind, rising earlier, fetching water, sweeping the yard, mending his worn shirt without a word. Their silence became its own language. One afternoon, Elias returned from the woods to find the chicken coop patched with fresh boards. He frowned, then saw the small handprints left in the dust. The Apache girl labeled a bringer of shame had quietly fixed it to keep the drafts away. He stood there longer than he meant, unsure if it was pride, confusion, or something else filling his chest. The weight of shame still lingered in her. Each time she met his eyes, Nayeli lowered hers quickly, shoulders curling in, yet Elias never pressed her, never judged her. He only nodded and carried on. That quiet respect began to chip at the armor she'd worn so long. One cold morning, she struggled up the slope from the creek, arms straining around a heavy bucket. Her breath came ragged, hands red with cold. Elias stepped forward, took the bucket, and set it down. She lifted her eyes, braced for reproach, for some cutting word, but he only said, "Leave it. I'll handle it." For a moment she stood frozen. Then she gave a small nod. In her eyes, he saw the shadow of shame dim, replaced with the faintest glint of trust. The cabin that once echoed with ash and silence still stood quiet, but not the same. The presence of a girl burdened with years of scorn did not make it heavier. Instead, it gave Elias reason to repair, to arrange, to care. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, something was forming thin, fragile strands of trust, strong enough to hold through the winter night. That winter struck harder than most. The wind howled day and night, carrying a cold that seemed intent on draining the life out of every living thing. Elias Mercer's old cabin groaned under each storm, and inside its walls, the frail body of Tala, the aging Apache mother, wasted away faster than anyone could stop. Her coughs had begun as scattered fits, but soon came sharp and relentless, tearing at her chest until each sound felt like it might split her in two. Nayeli spent sleepless nights pressing warm cloths to her mother's brow, whispering words in her own tongue, begging for just a little more time. Elias, when he came in from the cold, could only feed the fire, draw warm water, and set it near. He had no medicine, no miracle to give. He had only his hands that had once failed Elizabeth, hands that now trembled at failing again. One stormy night, the blizzard shrieked outside and snow rattled hard against the roof. Elias woke to the sound of ragged, shallow breaths. He rose quickly and saw Nayeli cradling her mother, eyes wide with helpless fear. Tala's gaze lifted, surprisingly clear, and she reached a thin hand toward Elias. He knelt beside her. "My daughter." "She is strong," Tala rasped, each word cut from her lungs. "But she does not know how to stop fighting. Do not. Let her be alone." Elias nodded, his throat locked tight. He didn't speak, but his eyes told what his voice could not. Tala exhaled, a long, final breath. Her hand fell into Nayeli's, then stilled. Morning brought silence heavier than any storm. Tala lay motionless, her face strangely peaceful, as though freed from years of hardship. Nayeli knelt beside her, head bowed into her mother's hands, her shoulders trembling but no sob breaking free. Her grief was too deep for sound. Elias stood rigid, fists clenched until the blood drained, feeling the old knife of memory twist again inside his chest. Without a word, he pulled on his coat and went outside for the shovel. The earth was frozen stiff, every strike of the blade sending shocks up his arms. Still, Elias worked, breath steaming, sweat chilling down his back. Each shovelful carried more than dirt, it carried Elizabeth's ghost. Tala's final plea, his own vow not to fail again. By noon, the grave was cut into the hard ground, and Elias leaned on the handle, eyes red but steady. He returned to the cabin and lifted Tala's light, brittle body into his arms. Nayeli walked behind, clutching a worn shawl. No preacher came. No prayers were spoken. Just 3 souls, then 2, moving together through the wind. Elias lowered Tala into the earth, wrapped her in her last blanket. Nayeli knelt, whispering in Apache, lips trembling as though she gave her childhood, her roots, back to the ground, when the final mound was pressed smooth. Elias stood silent, dirt clinging to his hands. He looked at Nayeli. She no longer knelt, she stood, her face stiff, her eyes swollen from tears that had not fallen. Their eyes met. No words, no promises, yet weight heavier than both could carry. They both knew from this day forward. Only 2 remained, bound to bear each other through the winter. That night the cabin felt emptier than it ever had. The fire burned high, yet the absence of Tala filled every corner. Elias sat hunched in his wooden chair. Nayeli sat against the wall, her eyes raw but dry. At last, she said, "She's gone." Her voice was flat, hollow. Elias nodded. She went peacefully. Nayeli's gaze lingered on the fire, her hands locked together as if holding something invisible. Elias longed to speak, to comfort, but he knew words would be useless. Instead, he rose, pulled down an extra blanket, and draped it over her shoulders. The small act made her head tilt slightly, lips quivering with something close to thanks. Though no sound came. They sat that way for a long while, listening to the storm, for the first time since Nayeli had come. Elias no longer felt the cabin belonged to him alone. Loss had hollowed the space, but it also bound them 2 wounded souls now carrying the same grief, the same duty. Elias understood then, from this moment, he could no longer abandon the Apache girl. And Nayeli, heavy with shame and sorrow, understood too that at least one man believed her, stood beside her. It was a fragile bond, born of a shallow grave and a winter storm, but strong enough to hold them both upright in the darkness. After the burial, winter still clung to the hills. Snow lay heavy, refusing to melt. Yet inside the weathered cabin, life began to shift. Elias and Nayeli, 2 souls bound by grief, found a rhythm quiet, uncertain, but steady. No vows were spoken, no names given to what they shared. Still, they moved side by side, like beams bracing one another against the storm. At first, their work ran parallel. Elias rose at dawn, axe in hand, heading into the timber. Nayeli went to the creek, carried water, lit the fire, and prepared the morning meal. By the time he returned, small things were already in place. The damp coat hung near the stove. Dust brushed from the chair. His gloves laid neatly on the table. Elias had never asked, yet she did it as if it were natural. Soon she pressed further into heavier chores. One morning, wind knocked loose several boards of the chicken yard. Elias set to repairing it alone. But as he braced a post, footsteps crunched behind him. He turned to see Nayeli carrying a bundle of planks. Her face was damp with sweat, strands of hair slipping from her braids. Elias fumbled, about to protest, but she laid the wood down and said softly, "I can hold it. You drive the nails." He hesitated, then nodded. They worked side by side in silence. Each time Elias lifted the hammer, her hand steadied the board. Each time their eyes met, both glanced quickly away. By the time the fence stood firm again, Elias felt something unfamiliar, an easing in his chest, shy but undeniable. Evenings were quieter still. Elias sat whittling scraps of pine, while Nayeli mended her mother's worn cloak. At times the firelight traced her face, the curve of her cheek, the shadow of lashes against her skin. Elias found himself staring longer than he should, then looking away clumsily, snapping the end off his carving. Nayeli noticed, her lips curving faintly, as if amused by his awkwardness. One afternoon, Elias was feeding Slate when he heard steady hammering. He turned to find Nayeli perched on a rickety ladder, patching the coop roof. Her patched deerskin dress was tied tight at the waist, her arms bare and steady. Alarmed, he rushed forward. "That's dangerous. Let me—" She glanced down, sweat glistening at her temple, eyes calm. "I want to—" Elias swallowed, braced the ladder with both hands, half worried, half admiring. And in that moment he saw her clearly, not someone to be sheltered only, but someone determined to build alongside him. Days slipped on. Their silences grew less strained. Elias began speaking small things. "The water's hot. I'll bring in the wood." Nayeli answered in kind. "I swept already. No catch today." Short words, but they filled the space. Proof neither was alone anymore. And sometimes, silence gave way to small, tentative closeness. One stormy night, the cabin shook with wind. Nayeli pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Elias noticed, rose, and fetched another, laying it across her. He turned to leave, but her hand brushed his for the briefest moment. No words, only a touch, but it left Elias's chest aching with something half buried. Another morning. He returned from the woods with snow melting on his shoulders. Nayeli stood waiting in the doorway, an old cloth in hand. She passed it to him without a word, but her eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. Elias lowered his head, clumsy with the warmth rising in him. No one hurried to name what was happening. No pledges, no ceremony, no titles, but each action, each glance, spoke of a bond forming. One evening, firelight filled the cabin. Elias sat in his chair. Nayeli stretched on the rug near the hearth. Suddenly, she looked at him, her voice soft as the wind outside. "If I stayed, would it trouble you?" Elias stiffened, caught unprepared. He searched her face, then let out a slow breath. "No," he said, voice low. "I wouldn't mind." Her gaze dropped back to the flames, but the faintest easing touched her lips, as if she had finally laid down a weight. Elias watched, his heart pulled taut with both relief and worry. He knew shadows of the past still lingered, that fear could rise again. Yet he also knew in these shy gestures, both of them had begun to take the first steps toward choosing each other. The old cabin was no longer just a shelter from the winter. It had become a place where two weary spirits, once alone, once afraid, were learning, carefully, to build something together. And with every small act, that fragile trust grew stronger. Winter had seemed endless, but slowly the sun began to linger longer in the gray sky. Snow softened, peeling back in patches to reveal dark, damp earth inside the weathered cabin. Elias and Nayeli had settled into a quiet rhythm, sweeping, tending the fire, sharing meals at the plain wooden table. They needed no speeches. Awkward glances and small gestures said more than any formal vow. One morning, as Elias fed the fire, he noticed Nayeli standing at the doorway, her hand resting lightly on her belly. The first light of day cut through the cabin's slats, casting her shadow across the floor. Something about the stillness of her posture struck him. Not weariness, but thoughtfulness. "Nayeli," he called, his voice rough from disuse. She turned slowly, eyes wavering. For a moment, he thought she might turn away, as she often did. Instead, she drew a deep breath and spoke, barely above a whisper. "Elias, I think I'm carrying a child." The words were simple, but they stopped the cabin cold. Elias froze, smoke from the fire curling around his hands. His heart hammered not from fear, but from something he never expected to feel again, sudden, startling joy. He stepped toward her. "Are you certain?" "Not yet. But I feel different. I know my own body." Her voice was soft but steady, her eyes carrying both hope and dread, as if braced for judgment. Elias held her gaze. Then, instead of questions or blame, he laid his calloused hand gently over her stomach. His fingers trembled. "I'm not afraid. If it's true, then it's part of you. And anything that's part of you, I want." Nayeli blinked quickly. Tears brimmed, but did not fall. Through countless winters, no words had ever been spoken to her with such simple acceptance. That afternoon, when the wind eased for a spell, Elias pulled open the drawer of his old table. From it he drew a small cloth bundle, inside of which lay a silver ring plain, dulled with age, but carefully shaped by hand. "I made this years ago, for Elizabeth," he said, voice low. "She never wore it. I kept it, not knowing why, but it doesn't belong to the past anymore." Nayeli stared at the ring, then at Elias. He didn't kneel, didn't recite vows. He only held it out, his eyes clear, steady, warmer than she had ever seen. "No ceremony," he said. "No preacher, no papers. Just this, you and me. We already belong to each other." Her hand shook as she lifted it. The silver slipped onto her finger, fitting as if it had been waiting for her all along. In that moment, no church bell rang, no witnesses stood. Yet both knew the bond was sealed. That night, the fire burned bright. Nayeli sat close to the hearth, turning the ring between her fingers, glancing up at Elias. He sat in his chair, quiet as always, but the curve of his mouth held something new, peace. The silence between them no longer felt like distance, but belonging. The next morning, Elias stepped outside to fetch wood, then stopped short. Nayeli was sweeping the narrow path before the cabin, hair tousled by a rare shaft of sunlight. He stood watching her a long while. For the first time in years, he saw his cabin not as a refuge for a lonely man, but as the beginning of a home. In the days that followed, everything felt different. When Elias split logs, Nayeli gathered kindling nearby, her smile faint but sure when he glanced at her. When Nayeli stirred a pot of stew, Elias set another log on the fire and pulled up a chair beside her. The shyness still lingered, but beneath it pulsed a quiet boldness, both reaching further toward each other. One evening, while wind howled beyond the walls, Nayeli laid a hand on her belly and whispered, "If there is a child, it will know it was wanted." Elias placed his hand over hers, his voice calm and firm. "It will know." So, in the fading cold of late winter, sorrow gave way to hope. From silence to respect, from tentative gestures to a simple bond of silver. Elias and Nayeli had chosen one another. They needed no hurried title, no formal vows. Just the certainty of presence and an old handmade ring was enough to root two hearts in a new beginning. At last, winter surrendered. Spring sunlight stretched across the hills, melting the snow and uncovering patches of soft, dark earth. The wind no longer cut like knives. Instead, it carried the sound of birds returning and the murmur of thawed streams. In the old timber cabin at the forest's edge, Elias and Nayeli no longer lived merely to endure. They began to build, as if tomorrow finally held promise. The first task was a small garden down the slope. Elias cut back brush and turned the soil, his shovel biting deep into the thaw. Nayeli knelt beside him, scarf wrapped around her hair, bare hands pulling stones from the rows. They spoke little, but their movements fell into rhythm. When Elias lifted the hoe, Nayeli was ready with the basket of seed. When sweat rolled into her eyes, Elias passed the canteen without a word. Straight furrows emerged beneath the morning sun. "Corn here," Elias said quietly. "And there. We'll try potatoes." Nayeli only smiled, her hand drifting briefly to her belly, eyes lit by thoughts of a future she hadn't dared to name. Inside the cabin, Elias began to fashion a cradle from leftover planks. His hands, used to splitting logs and mending fences, worked with unusual patience. He sanded the edges smooth, measured each angle, carved soft curves. One afternoon, Nayeli stepped in to find him bent over the half-built frame. She sat beside him and laid her hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up, but a shy smile tugged his mouth. "It's not much to look at yet," he muttered. Nayeli shook her head gently. "It's beautiful. Because you made it." On the porch, Elias built a swing from 2 planks and rope. It was simple, hardly more than a seat suspended from the beam, but it became Nayeli's favorite place to rest in the evenings. When the sun dipped low, she swayed gently back and forth while Elias settled beside her, hands resting on his knees, gaze turned toward the tree line. Sometimes their fingers brushed on the swing's worn edge. They didn't speak, but in those small touches lay the quiet truth they were no longer walking alone. The most striking change was what never happened. No one came looking for Nayeli. No voices called her back. No accusing eyes followed her. The world seemed to have cast her aside entirely. Yet in that abandonment lay a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to choose Elias, and for him to choose her. Without interference. Summer arrived, and the garden flourished. Corn rose tall, potato plants spread thick leaves, and hens filled the yard with their cackling. The swing on the porch was no longer just a resting place, it was where Elias and Nayeli sat each night after chores, watching the valley fade gold beneath the setting sun. Nayeli leaned her head against his shoulder, fingers tracing the silver ring he had given her. Elias rested a hand lightly on her knee, whittling small shapes from wood. It was no longer survival. It was life. In that peace. Elias felt something he had not dared imagine in years: contentment. The ghosts of Elizabeth still lingered in memory, but no longer haunted. Nayeli, with her steady eyes and quiet strength, had filled the emptiness with presence, with hope. One night, with moonlight spilling across the porch, Nayeli asked softly, "Do you regret it bringing us here?" Elias was silent a long while. Then he clasped her hand and held it firm. "If I regret anything, it's only that I lived too long in solitude before you came." Nayeli lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of relief. Their story did not end with a grand wedding or church bells. It ended with a garden, a cradle waiting, a porch swing swaying in the breeze. It ended with 2 people, once cast aside, who chose each other and chose to stay. What you've just witnessed is not the tale of heroes, but of ordinary souls, Elias, a man scarred by guilt, and Nayeli, a young woman branded with shame, against the winter, against loneliness. They found each other. Together they carved a life where none had seemed possible. If you believe that love and belonging can grow even in the harshest places, show your support by liking this story and leaving a comment. Tell us, what do you hope to see next for Elias and Nayeli with a child on the way? Will they find only peace? Or will new trials test the life they've built? Your support keeps these frontier stories alive and reminds us all that no matter the age, no matter the hardship, a home even the simplest kind is the greatest victory of the human heart.